Video games that were recalled. Ready, set, go. Over the years, there have been interesting cases of video games that would be set up to release just to be recalled after its launch or right before the game was supposed to hit store shelves. And there are some wild stories and examples of things like this happening, whether because of a national tragedy that something in the game accidentally could spark a controversy, or in some cases because of a marketing disaster or a massive flaw in the game itself. But Luke and I sat down to try to gather some of the most notable and wild examples of this happening decade to decade, and things just get really weird after a while. Let's go back and start at the late 80s, 1988 to be exact. George Michael's Faith was topping the charts, and George H.W. Bush just won the election, and at the same time, a game called The Race Against Time just released in April. This was an interesting adventure game developed by Codemasters, and it was designed as a tie-in for the Sport Aid charity event, where players control Omar Khalifa, a Sudanese runner traveling across 6 continents to light torch bowls and raise flags. The game featured side-scrolling mechanics with iconic landmarks like Buckingham Palace and the Sydney Opera House, and players navigated hazards like falling bricks, collapsing bridges, and extinguishing rain. You gotta collect hourglasses to get extra time, and if you were successful, it all culminated in a final torch event in New York to kick off Sport Aid. And this game also was, a tie-in to raise awareness and funds for the famine relief in Africa, capitalizing on the charity's event's global significance. Now, what's interesting is that this game was intended to try to raise £1 million for charity, but they ended up running into rushed timelines and limited production resources, meaning development maybe wasn't the smoothest. The game still would release in April of 1988 for the Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, and ZX Spectrum platforms, and the packaging featured Jesse Owens, who was a famous athlete. However, Codemasters failed to secure the rights to use this image, and Owens' estate ended up objecting to the game's release after its release, which ended up forcing a recall of the game. So then they ended up having to republish the game with a new cover, and the new cover featured Carl Lewis, who allowed his likeness to be used for free. However, there was a lot of damage from this game getting recalled because this kind of hampered the hype of the game and the publicity efforts, and just it affected the visibility overall during the height of the Sport Aid campaign when the game would have been the most relevant. So as this was all going down, the game also got mixed reviews. It was praised for its concept, but the gameplay, the visuals, and just some of the other stuff weren't really the best. Ultimately, the game ended up selling only 25,000 copies, which was far below the expectations that the game had, and Sport Aid was already financially strained. They did not recover the anticipated funds, leading to a reported £2 million debt, and to this day, the Jesse Owens controversy surrounding this game became one of the biggest marketing disasters of gaming in the 80s. And while that was a big example in the 80s, the 90s had quite a bit of things also going on that would see games get recalled, but things really come to a head in the 2000s. But let's look at the 90s first. Do you guys remember the original movie Fantasia that was like Disney, and there's music and Mickey Mouse and all sorts of stuff? Well, there was actually a video game based on this movie that was released in 1991 for the Sega Genesis, developed by Infogrames. And I didn't say that wrong, there is an R in that developer's name. The game was pretty straightforward. You play as Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice. It's a side scroller. You go through the level, you collect musical notes, and while there's only 4 levels in this game, they're all based off of ideas or areas from the first Fantasia movie, at least loosely. But here's the thing, this game maybe wasn't supposed to be developed in the first place. You see, Sega had already done a deal with Disney in the past. They released Castle of Illusion, and that game was actually pretty successful. So Sega was like, hey, let's do it again, but with Fantasia, because that's known, and it's like the 50-year anniversary at this point. It's weird to think that the 90s were, in fact, just 50 years disconnected from the 1940s. But 1991 was kind of a weird year. They had a Sonic the Hedgehog game releasing that summer, but they needed a game that would release in, the winter time to get ready for Christmas. So Sega kind of put a tight development schedule in place, and the studio had to replicate ideas from the animation and music, but, they had to make the music for a 16-bit console. Still in 1991, they showed the game off at CES, and it was also showcased at the Tech Toy launch. But here's where things get kind of weird with this one. So the game was kind of rushed out for the holiday season. The game did not receive well. It got pretty bad reviews and was deemed a massive disappointment by some outlets. But more specifically, Roy E. Disney, who was the nephew of Walt Disney and son of Roy O. Disney, was a longtime executive also for the Walt Disney Company. And apparently Sega got complaints from Roy E. Disney himself over the existence of this game, who he apparently made a promise to his uncle Walt. He means Walt Disney, but to name drop it that way is crazy. But he made a promise to Walt himself that Fantasia adaptations would not be made. And as it turned out, the licensing agreement between Sega and Disney was granted as an error or an oversight on Disney's part. And at Disney's request, they asked Sega to pull the plug, and sales of the game were to stop. Every unsold copy of the game would need to be destroyed. There was apparently 5,000 copies like floating around, and Sega would have to cease every advertisement that they had put out there for the game as well. It's wild to think that there was such a big effort to stop this game from making any money after the fact that it released. And remember, this game did not sell well. Actually, Mega placed the game at number 6 on their list of top 10 worst Mega Drive games of all time. And while the game's plug was pulled, it didn't stop the game from getting out there to retailers. And to this day, you can go on eBay and pick up a cartridge of this game for like $15 to $20 USD. So it's not like it became a super rare game with the game being pulled from stores. By the time the game was recalled, most people who were going to pick up this game probably had already picked it up. Now, I do think it's interesting that Roy Disney was like, there's not supposed to be any adaptations of Fantasia. Why did we greenlight this? Why did this happen? Because at the same time, Roy Disney himself had already began production on what would become Fantasia 2000, as early production already started in 1990. So maybe at this point, he just didn't want the whole like Fantasia brand tainted by this bad video game release. And it wasn't really about some promise that he had made, because he was already working on a sequel. I mean, that's like an adaptation, right? That's like a newer version, let alone the fact that they re-released Fantasia like 15 times at this point. And mind you, this was a new Fantasia project after a project that was already greenlit and worked on for a while in the 1980s had been shelved recently in favor of Mickey's Christmas Carol. Fantasia 2000 released in 1999. The same year the Pokemon movie released. And I do have vague memories of seeing this movie in theaters. I mean, I don't remember very many movies I saw as a very young kid. Just a handful. Mulan, Madeline, and the Rugrats movie. I don't know. I have vague memories of seeing Fantasia 2000 in theaters. And then after that, they tried to work on a third Fantasia movie, which had the working title of Fantasia 2006. That ended up getting shelved in 2004, and that was it. Also, just to prove even more so that the whole like Fantasia adaptation not supposedly supposed to be a thing, about still being a thing that was just weirdly applied just for Sega, is that in 1983 there was an Atari game based on Sorcerer's Apprentice that was greenlit and made. The game appears multiple times and referenced in Epic Mickey. There's Fantasia stuff in the Kingdom Hearts series. And there was a game called Fantasia Music Evolved for the Xbox Kinect in 2014. And then that features Queen and Bruno Mars in it also, for whatever reason.
In November of 1994, Disney's animated storybook The Lion King released, and it was developed by Media Station and published by Disney Interactive, as you could have guessed, I guess. It was an interactive storybook that was designed for children aged 3 to 8 and allowing them to engage with the Lion King, cast and, the different animals through point-and-click minigames and stuff like that. Upon release, it was discovered that this game had significant major technical issues that prevented a lot of people from playing the game and went as far as blue screening systems. So, there would be like a little 3-year-old trying to play this game, and all of a sudden the computer gets a blue screen of death, and the child probably started crying or something. I don't know what kids in the 90s did. Probably cry a lot, right? Since this game was released during the holiday season, obviously a lot of people picked it up, and a lot of families were unable to run this game on their new computers at the time. And even if you had one of the top computers, there's still a high chance this game would crash your whole system.
Wah, wah.
There was like the news stories going around that Disney was killing Christmas with this bad game at the time, and it's actually kind of funny. After Disney acknowledged these issues, they initiated recalls, and you were able to just order a revised version of the game that was more compatible.
Have you guys ever heard of Sonic Blast Man? No, it's not a Sonic the Hedgehog game, it's this guy. Kind of a big figure in some arcades across the United States, and this game series was developed developed by a studio known as Taito, a pretty big Japanese company actually. The game's pretty simple. There's a big old target on the arcade and you punch it, and that's how you play the game. Every target has a different number of tons of resistance or whatever. The game has a pair of gloves you're supposed to wear, and you punch the punch pad, and you get 3 hits, so you gotta make it count here. You finally get to feel like the hero. You get to help this woman who's being assaulted. There's a baby carriage getting pushed into the middle of a freeway. Oh no. I don't know, there's terrorists, a giant crab, and an asteroid also featured in this game. But this game ended up getting its own plug pulled, where Taito ended up straight up removing the arcade from various arcades. But 5 years after the launch of the game, there was some controversy around it. The US Consumer Product Safety Commission decided to go after Taito of America Corp., alleging that the company failed to file a report required by the Consumer Product Safety Act regarding a potentially dangerous defect in 370 Supersonic Blastman video game arcades. In turn, Taito ended up agreeing to pay a civil penalty of $50,000, and all this stemmed from Taito apparently failing to report over the periods of 1991 to 1994 70 cases where young players fractured or injured their wrists and arms as a result of hitting Blastman's punching pads. As a part of the settlement that Taito agreed to pay the penalty on, they denied any wrongdoing or even mentioning that Blastman could be defective or unreasonably dangerous. They also denied that they knowingly violated the report requirements, and ultimately in 1995, they voluntarily recalled the game and compensated the owners and distributors for the arcade games. I'm just curious, if you were one of the 70 people who may have fractured or injured your wrist on this game back in the day, please leave a comment. I just want to know what your life is like nowadays. Let's move on to another one.
In 1997, the developer Bizarre Creations released a game called Formula 1 97. Why would they do 97 if they released it in 97? Shouldn't they do 98?
Ask Microsoft Flight Simulator, releasing Flight Simulator 2024 at the end of 2024, and then the game wasn't even ready.
It's still not ready, right?
It's a mess.
Anyway, so they released this game, and I guess they didn't check with their lawyers because the game's packaging had the FIA logo, the Fédération Internationale des Automobiles. It's like a French thing, I can't pronounce it. But it had the logo on the box, and they didn't get the authorization to use the logo. So they used a copyrighted logo on the packaging that they didn't have any rights to. So obviously there was legal issues, and they had to recall all the copies of the game that were out there. This took actually 6 weeks before they started doing this, so a lot of copies were actually sold and distributed since they were so slow on issuing the recall. They actually would go on to get sued by the FIA, even though they did the recall, and the court did ultimately side with the publisher. They were allowed to sell the game again, but without the logo this time. So obviously, I don't know, I guess when you release a game you should make sure you have all the rights to logos that you put on the box, but hey.
The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, often deemed as one of, if not the best video game ever. And I mean, it was a pretty big deal back in the Nintendo 64 days. But did you know Ocarina of Time still had its own little controversies that caused Nintendo to, shuffle some things around a bit? Now, back in the day during the Nintendo 64 era, Nintendo couldn't just patch a game or, do a little update, everyone downloads it, boom, the game's good to go. When stuff like this happened, they would have to straight up do a re-release, or if they weren't doing a re-release, they would essentially update the game and all future versions of the game would be updated moving forward, which is what Nintendo chose to do in the case of Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Now, there's actually 3 different versions of Ocarina of Time that are floating out there. Interestingly enough, in the original 1.0 and 1.1 versions of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, there was some controversy surrounding the music that was used in the Fire Temple. It seems like the Fire Temple's music contained religious-themed vocals from the Muslim faith. One line translated into English states, "I bear witness that there is no God but Allah." So when version 1.2 would release for the Nintendo 64 in an updated cartridge later on, and all subsequent re-releases, the song would actually be replaced with what seems to kind of be like a remix of the original Shadow Temple music. The new song doesn't have any lyrics or words to it, just some moaning. This ghostly female singer moaning. Take a listen. Also, in the Nintendo 64 versions of the game, all of the versions, there's the crescent moon and star symbol that are present on the mirror shield and in a couple of other places. This ended up being switched out in the later GameCube release of the game. It was replaced with this diamond-shaped symbol instead that was used in Majora's Mask. Probably they're trying to, clear themselves of any similarities or resemblance of symbolism from Islam, especially because the symbol is supposed to represent like Ganondorf, who's like a bad guy, and they didn't want to like make this whole like accidental antagonistic statement about certain religions in the context of a Legend of Zelda game. There was a couple of other interesting things in the original version of The Legend of Zelda. Ganondorf has red blood. However, with the ESRB cracking down on things, they're implementing like the new rated E for everyone thing. Nintendo decided to update the blood to be green instead of red, probably to try to keep that rating and also kind of keep their, kid-friendly image that Nintendo was like really kind of strict about back in the 90s. There are other little things, but it seems like the initial reason that Nintendo stepped in and changed Zelda between version 1 and version 1.1 was mostly just because of bugs and glitches, which wasn't too uncommon back in the day when bugs and glitches would be found out about, especially in a popular game like Zelda. They would just reprint the game with an update. But the later version, 1.2, did have more dramatic and more game-changing changes within that version of the game.
Actually, there's another game that I remember that had a similar issue or a similar reason for a recall, and that game was called Kakuto Chojin Back Alley Brutal, which was a Microsoft Game Studios published game that was supposed to compete with Tekken and Virtua Fighter at the time, right? And it was directed at mature audiences, like, it was like supposed to be like brutal and, fist fighting, that good stuff. The game actually featured a Middle Eastern stage, and in the background theme, you could hear similar Islamic chants at the time, and obviously the inclusion of these verses was like deeply offensive to Islamic groups and stuff like that.
Fight.
And so Microsoft issued a recall for the game and would start reprinting the game and recall all unsold copies. Now, they actually would not reprint this game, I think. And I think this game was also not that well received in the first place. So I guess they just decided to cut their losses at this point and just be done with Kakuto Chojin. When I was looking into this, I read that like they just sampled some of these like Islamic sounding chanters and they didn't even like listen to what they said, right? So they had no idea what they were putting in the game. And they just showed up in the background track somewhere, and people found out, and then
That's kind of, as I assume, what also happened with The Legend of Zelda with the chants. I don't think Nintendo was originally trying to put like passive, like Muslim prayer into the Fire Temple. I think it likely was a sample that contained lyrics that, if you don't know what it is, you don't know what it is. Similarly, LittleBigPlanet from 2008 ran into a similar issue where one of the tracks used in the game had expressions from the Quran in it. But that ended up instigating a recall of copies of LittleBigPlanet from retailers to avoid offending Muslims and give the developers time to remove the lyrics. This actually resulted in the overall release of the game getting delayed because the game had already gone gold. Retailers had the game, and then they had to reprint the game. It's interesting. Back in 2008, I felt like they probably had the technology to update the game with a patch, but at the same time, it wasn't very commonplace. Nonetheless, LittleBigPlanet did still have 2 patches released around the time of the launch of the game. One of them was removing the lyrics from the song also. So I don't know if they reprinted some versions but still issued a patch to make sure that all versions across the board were the same. It's a little bit of a gray area as to what exactly happened. Or maybe they recalled the game to make sure they had the patch ready and then the game still came out after the delay. I don't know. It's a little confusing with how the timeline adds up and what we can find out about it and exactly what content was in the patches. But nonetheless, it was a similar issue that resulted in LittleBigPlanet getting recalled also.
We got one last game from the late 90s that was released in 1998, and that is Tiger Woods 99 PGA Tour Golf. We're back to naming the game the year that it's not the year that it's coming out, but the next year. So, we're back on track here. This game, classic golf game, Tiger Woods PGA games, I don't know. They've been the same for the last 20 years, 20, 30 years. I don't know. They still make them, right? I think they still do. I feel like I see them sometimes.
They might take a break in between some releases, but they're around. And to be fair, they're not literally the same game every year. There's slight changes year to year.
Yeah, what I meant by that is you hit the golf ball and then you try to go into a hole, and it's video game form. So that's all I meant, you know what I mean? Like how FIFA is like you try to kick the ball into the goal for the last 25 years. I mean, that's just how the sports works, but you know what I mean. It's not like there's some crazy gameplay invention every time.
Why was it recalled, Luke?
Sorry. It was recalled because the game disc included a file called zzDummy.dat on the PlayStation disc, and if you access this via PC, it contained a file called The Spirit of Christmas, which was an early uncensored short film by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park. And obviously, you can't have pilot-type South Park stuff on your E-rated game, and so they had to recall it and reissue the game without that episode on it.
So that's interesting. So it wasn't something accessible in the game itself, but it was something just like in the files that was found.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of reminds me of that file on Halo 2 Vista. Remember that?
Right. They had a similar issue where Halo 2 Vista ended up being a really expensive recall because of a .as file. It was an error file that was in the original Bungie Halo 2 that if something in like the debug menus would happen, the error message would come up on like development Xboxes. And for whatever reason, the company porting Halo 2 for PC didn't look through, I guess, all of the files, and that error message ended up making it into Halo 2 Vista's retail version of the game. And interestingly enough, while those files wouldn't have been accessible on the original Xbox, on the PC it's a lot easier to access, and that caused this huge, massive issue with Halo 2. I wonder if that cost Microsoft so much money that by the time Halo 3 was done with development, they're like, you know what, let's just not even do PC. And because I think Halo 2 cost them so much money to do the whole Vista thing.
Took them like 12 years to Halo 3 on PC, right? Back to the Tiger Woods game. EA had to recall like over 100,000 copies of this game, which is like it's a ton, I guess, for the late 90s, right? And that probably cost them a ton of money as well.
This kind of also, like, it's a little bit ahead, something we're going to talk about in the 2000s, but I'll talk about now. But it is kind of similar to the situation that also happened with Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and the infamous Hot Coffee mod, which was like a sex minigame that was not enabled in the game itself. It was in the files, but with modifying the game files through the PC, you could access the minigame, which resulted in the game getting an AO rating, which most stores, video game stores across the board back then, had strict policies about not selling AO rated games in their stores, which meant the game would be recalled everywhere, and ultimately Rockstar would have to reprint the game, removing the minigame altogether. And the Hot Coffee mod would be only ever referenced again in little Easter eggs in later Grand Theft Auto games, but never actually featured in a game. Also, in this video, we can't show anything even remotely close to the Hot Coffee mod, because one time we got a video taken down because we had pixels censored on the screen.
I made it look like that Kanye cover with the pixelated thing in the middle, like the red cover, you know what I mean? And it still got taken down. You know, the video still got taken down. We had to re-upload it. That's actually crazy, you know? They're so strict on it.
Yeah, it's a little silly because we had a whole thing censored.
I don't even think you could tell the movement on Carl, you know, or anything, you know what I mean? It's just pixels, and somehow it's still detected. I don't know.
It was literally the most tame video game sex scene, I think, out there. It had to have been in like the, you know what I mean? For like, everything was covered already.
Yeah, they were just try-humping.
They definitely were clothed, I think, mostly. Or partially. It was very uneventful. I was very disappointed to watch it. I was trying to watch it for the art of it, and it just wasn't good.
So, since we're in the 2000s now, I'm going to talk about the first game that was recalled and released in the 2000s, and that was WWF No Mercy, which released in November of 2000. Now, during that time, wrestling had an all-time peak in popularity. It was like the end of the Attitude Era. You had like The Rock being like a mainstream character. You had Stone Cold Steve Austin, Triple H, The Undertaker, all those people. If you watched wrestling in the 90s, you probably remember all this stuff they used to do back then. And No Mercy was a sequel to the WWF WrestleMania 2000 game for the N64. And people already liked the WrestleMania 2000 game a lot, so a ton of people were excited for this one to release. Now, when the game released, the early copies of this game had a critical issue with save data, and players were not able to save 99% of the time. It would just completely wipe your data, so you were not able to progress through the game and save. So you either had to play the game in one sitting, I guess, or just lose your save file every time. This glitch was so widespread that DHQ would issue a recall for all the affected cartridges, and people were able to send in their cartridges and I think return it to some retailers and get a updated version of the game. Despite these big issues, this game is still considered one of the best wrestling games of all time, and has a huge cult following actually, and people still enjoyed this game a lot. So I guess if the game is really good, people are willing to forgive stuff like this.
Was that the game where you could like climb out of the ring, reach into the crowd, and like pull a chair or like a trophy out and then beat the other person down with it? Mm-hmm. I remember that game. It was kind of fun.
Yeah, I don't know. It was a banger. But hey, I guess if you had an early copy of the game, it wasn't that much of a banger. But
there was a Spider-Man game in the early 2000s released. It was kind of good. It was for the PlayStation 1. I mean, I think it was kind of good. People liked it. The sequel, which was called Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro.
Hey, yo.
Crazy name choice. This game was recalled. Not for the reasons you would think with a name like Enter Electro, but because of 9/11.
No.
Sorry, I'm not trying to make light of this of 9/11, but just like the whiplash from the reasoning behind this thing getting recalled is insane. Essentially, the big finale of this game would have taken place on top of the World Trade Center, where you'd have like the big final battle. But the game was set to release on September 18th, 2001. So following the September 11th attacks, Activision chose to delay the release of the game, and they wanted just to remove all of the references to the World Trade Center altogether. The game got pushed back an entire month, which really isn't that much to like completely rework a bunch of content, but that's what they ended up doing. They replaced the World Trade Center with 2 generic unnamed buildings, towers, in New York.
I feel like that's kind of weird, no?
It honestly looks exactly the same, except they added a bridge at the roof connecting the two to make it look like it's a slightly different building. They also renamed the names of like 4 levels. The levels are originally called Crash Flight, Downward Spiral, Aces High, and Top of the World. They renamed all those to Wind Tunnel, the Corkscrew, the Gauntlet, and the Best Laid Plans. Somehow, the pre-9/11 version of the game did end up leaking online around 2015. Someone said that they were able to source it from the childhood copy of the game, so maybe there were pirated versions already circulating pre-launch of the game before the recall could catch them, and then later it surfaced online 15 years later.
I wonder if it's one of those things where store got a copy early and then like didn't send it back.
Yeah, maybe, or some store got it early and started making pirated copies of the game. Nonetheless, there aren't any sources verifying that this like supposed August release is a thing, but you can see like what the original game was supposed to look like now online. It's leaked out there.
Samurai Shodown 5 was a classic arcade game in Japan, and in 2004, a version for the Neo Geo AES, standing for Advanced Entertainment System, was supposed to release. The original Samurai Shodown V game was pretty popular because of its brutal like finishers and, you know, just like kind of like the Mortal Kombat type charm, right? Like just very gory overall. And when they promoted the game to release on the Neo Geo AES, they did not talk about the fact that this release would be heavily censored and all the gore and all the finishers were cut in this version. So upon release, fans discovered this and were pretty upset about this. The game was also rushed and unfinished. I think they tried to push it out before the holiday season of that year, and that led to a lot of fans just being more and more upset with the game. And they started recalling the game and releasing a fixed, uncensored version with the uncensored fatalities. They didn't produce a lot of those copies. It's actually really hard to find a re-released, uncensored version of this game because, in the first place, the Neo Geo AES wasn't a very popular console because I think it was very expensive at the time, so not a lot of people picked it up. But I mean, I don't know, people still liked the game once it was fixed and once the fatalities and the gore were back in. But yeah, it's just like kind of a niche little story that probably, I don't know, nobody in the West ever heard of.
I have a real yikes game that I wanted to talk about for this video.
A real yikes game. How more yikes can it get?
It's pretty yikes, I'm gonna be honest.
Oh, okay.
The Guy game was this like PlayStation 2 and Xbox game that released in 2004. It was essentially an adult video game that had circumvented the rating system and was able to get an M rating instead. Okay, what's stupid is it was like just a trivia game show style type game. It's like multiple choices and whatnot.
Like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire when we played it at 3 a.m.
This one was inspired by the Girls Gone Wild series of videos that were popular in the early 2000s, I guess.
Like adult type videos or
adult type videos.
All right.
This game ended up being like a big political issue because the game ended up getting a mature rating because it like so carefully tried to control like what amount of sexualized content was showcased, and it always like just skirted that line, never getting the adults only classification, which would then cause a lot of groups and legislators to try to invoke like stricter restrictions on the distribution of like sexually explicit content in video games, especially games that minors had access to. This game often was like grouped alongside like Leisure Suit Larry games, which also had kind of like some raunchy scenes in those games as well. Like as an adult, it's not that offensive or anything, but especially in the early 2000s, there was definitely like this gray area as to how like this content could be released and like who had access to buying games. But then things take a twist with this game. A lawsuit ends up coming out from an anonymous plaintiff who is referred to in like legal documents as Doe, for like Jane Doe, against the studio that developed the game, Top Heavy Studios, and they requested an injunction to discontinue the release of the Guy game. As it turned out, the plaintiff was filmed exposing her breasts in the Guy game, and she was 17 years old when they filmed it for the game. She was approached while she was a minor by a developer or by like production of the Guy game, and she'd given producers a fake ID card. There was inconsistent information on how like the use of images and whatnot would be distributed and used for this project.
Yeah, I wonder if we can show any of this game now.
I don't even know. Okay, so it gets kind of worse. So apparently the anonymous plaintiff, who was the female shown in the game, had only found out that she was in the game when her brother told her that the game had images of her topless in it. Whoa. And she wasn't even aware that her likeness was used in the game.
You know, at first I was like, when's the yikes coming in? But we definitely hit it.
This is how like the Wikipedia page on it describes it. I'm just going to read it directly. Her counsel argued that she was not able to consent to appear in the Guy game, rendering her release form void, and that the publishers had misappropriated her likeness by failing to discover her age despite inaccuracies in her release form and proceeding to publish the footage. Top Heavy Studios tried to defend themselves in this, saying that the female had entered and participated in the contest willingly and made fraudulent representations about her age to the production team, making it reasonable for the studios to have treated her as an adult. Then there was an injunction restraining distribution of the game that was granted at a trial in January of 2005. That was successfully upheld that summer, though the trial did not resolve the question as to whether or not Top Heavy had produced a word we can't say in our videos, but you guys know what it is.
Call of Duty points.
Yeah, Call of Duty points. Long story short, Top Heavy Studios ceased distribution of the Guy game, protesting on their website that the man had decided that their fun and hilarious presentation of Spring Break revelry just wasn't appropriate for the world of gaming. Which is a crazy way to try to justify that at the end. Like, you could make some argument about, like, not doing due diligence maybe, and like maybe they could have handled things better, but man, doubling down is not the route you would expect. But this was 2004 and 5, so I don't know. That's insane to me. Wild. The takeaway is that this game is banned on Twitch. So you're not allowed to play it on Twitch, I think as of 2015. I mean, rightfully so. This game, it's insane. I don't know.
While we were on the topic of yikes reason a game was recalled, I got another game that kind of had a yikes reason why a game was recalled. And this was a Nintendo DS game in 2007 called Bis no Yuku DS series wa Gokoro no Moto.
What did you just say?
Something Japanese. I don't know. Just imagine I said the kanji perfectly. Okay. This was a game that was supposed to teach you business language and like conversational skills, right? So this was like a learning game. Now the reason for the recall is that an employee who worked on the game was arrested the week before the game released for, how can I say this? For touching women without consent. The guy was just straight up arrested, and the publisher was like, on launch day, we're not putting out this game, we're recalling every single copy of it and burying it under a rock. So, it's pretty yikes as well. The game itself wasn't yikes. The person who worked on the game was yikes.
You can't always separate the art and the artist.
No, you can't. Definitely. There's a couple people who that doesn't work for. There is one thing that I think is pretty popular in Japan, and that is wrestling. And there's another thing that is not very popular in Japan, and that is the Xbox. So when the Xbox 360 launched, Microsoft tried making a wrestling game to promote the Xbox 360, and that game was called Wrestle Kingdom. Now, this game released in 2005 and was developed by UK, who had made WWE games in the past, so they were kind of, known for making decent wrestling games. And Wrestle Kingdom included all like the big Japanese promotion, like New Japan Wrestling, All Pro Japan Wrestling, or whatever, all that good stuff. Now, after the release, it was discovered that this wrestling game, much like WWF No Mercy, also had a save file issue that would corrupt your save file. The developer would end up recalling this game within hours of the game releasing, and all the copies were pulled from store shelves. They had to cancel a bunch of release events that were planned for the game because, obviously they didn't have a fixed version for the release events ready. So this kind of hindered the launch of this game, and, maybe if this game would have been more popular, the 360 would have been more popular in Japan, but actually probably not. I don't know.
Two things. When I was in Japan, I did watch wrestling on TV. Insane. They were the longest fights ever. They just kept fighting and fighting and fighting. And then right when you think it's done, they do some sort of move to save themselves last second. There was some guy, I think he was from Australia or the UK, and they were trying to set him up as like this villain for some villain arc. But then they introduced another villain who's even more villain. And then they were going to face off, but then he was going to face off against who I think is like the hero. It was crazy. Second thing, you're absolutely right about the Xbox not being popular in Japan. I went to a video game store, and they had every single game console you could ever imagine, large selections of all the games, and then just at the bottom shelf, just like if you look very closely, a couple of Xbox games, and that was it. I mean, like, we're talking walls of games and a bottom shelf dedicated just to Xbox. That also was crazy.
You can only see it if you, like, fall on the ground and accidentally look at it,
Literally. I gotta find the wrestlers and send those to you, too, because that was also insane, dude. They were fighting for the longest time.
I wonder which promotion you watched, because there's, like, a couple...
It was something in December, and they were, like, hyping up the big, like... comeback in January. Okay, so Mind Quiz was a game that was kind of surprising that it got recalled. Specifically, it got recalled in UK. Ubisoft ended up voluntarily pulling the game from stores upon complaints that they had utilized the word spastic, which is kind of an ableist phrase to say. And this would be something that would pop up if you like answered a question incorrectly or something. Ubisoft did a quick PR spin turnaround saying as soon as they're made aware of the issue, they stopped distribution of the game and they're working with retailers to pull the game off the market. The game was continued to be sold in Australia though, because I guess the word isn't considered as offensive over there.
I guess I can see it. Australian's pretty, it's pretty wild language usually,
It's definitely a wild place.
Yeah, I mean, hey, there's 6-foot scorpions that kill you outside your house, so I guess...
You're not afraid of words hurting you, yeah. What's interesting, though, is this actually had larger repercussions as Mario Party 8, which was being developed for the Wii at the time, also apparently used the word in the game, and this caused Nintendo to announce that the British version of the game was delayed due to production issues. Apparently, some versions of the game included that word again, and because Ubisoft had just done it a month earlier, Nintendo wanted to like also make sure that they're being careful. Nintendo said that the offensive word had been replaced at a code level, and then the software was reproduced, so they were confident that they had taken correct action. However, they also said that they could not 100% guarantee that every copy of the initial batch of games were returned. So they were like, you might run into it in the wild and it might have that word, but like we try to do the right thing.
The game might call you,
The game might call you spastic, which is interesting that they even went through all of that, I guess. But the game, sold like 8 million copies. So like, I'm curious to know, like, was it like a game, like a file in the game? Why do they have to like be determined that they changed it at like a code level? What does that mean? But yeah, we don't know. But it is interesting.
They could have been like setting themselves up for potential lawsuits, or like to defend themselves against potential lawsuits. I don't know.
Right. I mean, Nintendo already was having a couple of interesting things pop up around this time. They had the whole like recall with the Wiimotes.
Yeah.
The Wii remotes. The strap wasn't like sturdy enough. It was like really thin. I had a day one Wii. I got it for Christmas, but my mom got it day one when the Wii came out. And I remember looking at the little like strap thing because it was on all over the news, and it was pretty thin. And I even went through the whole Nintendo recall process, and they sent me new straps that were slightly thicker, so I could see firsthand that they were different. But Nintendo was dealing with that. They had done something in Animal Crossing review copies of City Folk also, where they like had an offensive slur in the game that one of the villagers would call you. It was a whole big deal. I talked about it on my Animal Crossing videos on Rocket Elijah. It was Nintendo was just like dodging bad PR left and right through the Wii era. So I don't know. It's insane.
Yeah, that Wiimote thing though reminds me of a personal story from recently. I was playing Switch Sports, and I bought these little bats for the controllers. You see them? And I was like playing, and I was so into it. I was like, all of a sudden this like cracks, and this thing just flies off and flies into my TV almost. So I guess I had a little accident, almost broke my TV. But hey, that happens sometimes.
You survived though?
I did survive. My TV survived too.
Well, that's what's important. What about the drywall?
Might be a little hole in the wall, but hey, that's for the landlord to pick out.
Yeah. No big, not your problem.
So then we got a notorious game called Limbo of the Lost, which is notorious because it stole a ton of assets from games like Oblivion, Thief, and Diablo 2. And there's actually a great video by Mandalore Gaming where he goes into a lot of detail about what exactly they ripped off. But they just straight up plagiarized like assets, like tables, music, stuff like that, and put it in their game, and then released it and tried to make money off it, which obviously is super illegal, and ended with the company going under. And that's it. Also, the game was apparently like pretty dog water.
That could be not surprising considering they plagiarized a bunch of it.
There's people that speculate they did this because the game was in development hell for 10 years. And for some reason, they couldn't finish this game, so I guess they decided to cut more corners and release it with the stolen assets. I mean, that's what some people attribute as the reason they did this in the first place. But, like, I don't know. It's just stupid to do. I don't know, like, even in 2007, you should know better. I don't know. Then I got another game from 2006, 2007 that was called SNK versus Capcom Card Fighters. And this game had a bunch of game-breaking bugs, once you played through the game like a second time or something, or once you interacted with the NPC that was required to process the game would just crash, and it would like soft lock you there. There's nothing you could do. So once they identify, they issued replacement cartridges, etc., etc. But there's one interesting thing about this game why I want to bring this up is that the fixed cartridges actually look different than the original cartridges. The fixed cartridges have a black and white graphic in the background, while the bugged version have the full color label in the background. So when you see it, you can actually physically see if it's the bugged version or the non-bugged version, which I think is kind of interesting.
That is interesting. That actually is similar to what happened with Metroid Other M. Too. That game was wild in itself that it even exists. It was like I guess like a reboot prequel to Metroid, and it was like supposed to be really story driven, story heavy, people didn't like the way that they handled the story, and the gameplay was just not as good as the Metroid Prime trilogy, which was just a few years before. Nonetheless, on top of everything with Metroid Other M being kind of a miss of a game, it wasn't the home run people wanted it to be. There was a bug in the game where there's a door in an area called Sector 3 that's permanently locked. If you got that bug, you were just soft locked in the game or hard locked in the game. Your game was essentially bricked. You would have to backtrack there, and you weren't able to do anything. Nintendo ended up having to do a recall to update the games. People already had the game at that point, so they set up a whole program that would allow you to send in your SD card or your entire Wii console to have your save files repaired.
Wait, that's actually interesting. So instead of like reprinting the game, they just like...
I think they also reprinted the game, but...
For future customers though, right?
Yeah, for future customers, but then they had a whole system for people who had purchased the game. I guess, according to Wikipedia, which is my source in this case, Other M uses a dual-layer disc, and Nintendo said that some Wii consoles have difficulty reading data off of a large capacity medium due to a contaminated laser lens of an optical disc drive. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like a Wii issue.
It also sounds incredibly stupid, because if they're like, hey, the Wii can't read this, why print it on that disc in the first place?
It definitely was well into the time where other game companies were already like doing quite a bit in the digital format. I mean, this is like 2010. Like Black Ops 1 is the Call of Duty of this year. You know what I mean? Like they were far along. Patches are a thing. You know, Nintendo is a little behind when it comes to that type of stuff.
There was a company that was called Humongous Entertainment, and they released a bunch of games, you know, Freddy Fish and the Case of the Missing Kelp Seeds, Pajama Sam, No Need to Hide When It's Dark Outside, and Spy Fox in Tri-Serial. Some crazy game names, like some of the craziest game names I've ever seen. You know, the games, whatever. But they used a engine in the game called Scum VM to re-release these games on the Wii, which, you know, helped these games run on newer systems. So these games were re-released on the Wii, blah, blah, blah. And they did not credit the Scum VM engine. So they ended up with a lawsuit because they didn't get the authorization to do this. And they would eventually, you know, settle in court. And part of the settlement was that these games were recalled. So I guess these were court-ordered recalls, which also is a little different than some of the other stories we've talked about.
The good old days of Wii shovelware, just doing whatever they can.
And this game was also printed physically, so these you know, these original games are kind of a collector's item if you can get your hands on them.
I can get Pajama Sam for $17.09. Dude, $12.21 on the Wii. I had a feeling those shovelware games, dude, they were overprinted. They would be thrown into the little like bargain bins and grocery stores, at least here in the US. You know, I don't know how it was in Germany, but like it was these types of games are everywhere.
We had this thing called the software pyramid, which were like these setups that stores had. There was just like a pyramid shelf, and it just had like a ton of shovelware in it. And the good news. And there was like a publisher called like Green Man Gaming, and they had like the cover and then like a green box, like a neon green box, and all they sold was shovelware and stuff, and re-releases of games. Yeah.
So I guess that kind of brings us to like modern day, right? Like, are we in the more modern era? Obviously, nowadays, first of all, there's less shovelware put out there, so licensing stuff usually doesn't result in like full-on recalls like we saw in previous decades. It's mostly just bad games, I guess. Cyberpunk 2077 technically got a physical recall for the, what was it, Xbox One and PS4 versions of the game, like the base versions. The game, we all know about that controversy. We know that the game was like not functioning the way that it was supposed to, specifically on the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 4 version was like in the worst shape out of all of them. And I think the Xbox One gets grouped into that a lot. But the Xbox One version did at least kind of run. PlayStation 4 version was a mess. So that was a whole ordeal.
Tim played the Xbox One version and beat it, right?
I don't think he beat it, but he played a lot of it.
Oh, he played a lot of it, yeah.
And it was interesting because at the same time he was playing Cyberpunk 2077, we were trying to play Scrabble with him on Xbox, and his Xbox could not run Scrabble for the life of it, but it could run Cyberpunk 2077.
That just shows you how intense Scrabble is, you know?
I don't think we ever did end up playing Scrabble. I think we've had that game for like 4 years.
I think you and me played Scrabble, though.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. We won, and I was like, what is it? I never played Scrabble before. I didn't understand the game. I was like, this is a bullshit, you know?
And then we've talked about this game in a bunch of videos, so I don't want to like overdo it, but like Concord is probably the most recent example of a game getting recalled. The game was shut down and canceled, so anybody who purchased the game would get refunds and the game would get pulled from the shelves. So obviously Concord counts too. But there were two interesting games that you put on this list also that you wanted to talk about that I think are interesting that we should talk about.
Similar to Cyberpunk 2077, Batman Arkham Knights on the PC also was majorly bugged and majorly broken. So, you know, they ended up issuing a recall for the PC version specifically this time. The console versions apparently were fine, I guess. Didn't need to be recalled, but I remember the PC version had super bad ratings on Steam and, you know, Metacritic and stuff like that. So people were pretty upset. And after a while, they would patch it and re-release it in 2015 or late 2015. Even after the re-release, people were still complaining about some technical issues with the game. So I guess they did not fix it with the re-release. They would issue full refunds until the end of 2015 for any customer that purchased the game, even after the re-released version. So I guess they also technically did a recall for the re-release, which also is kind of insane.
Okay, and then I see on our list here we have Two Human and X-Men Destiny.
Yes, those are actually interesting because those games were released in 2008 and 2011 respectively. They were not recalled until 2012 when the developer Silicon Knights was in a legal battle with Epic Games over their use of the Unreal Engine 3. And the court ruled that Silicon Knights infringed upon Epic Games' rights. So they had to recall these games, and they were ordered to cease production of any future copies. So they had to recall this 4-year-old game that was made in the Unreal Engine 3. And I guess this 1-year-old game that was made, released the previous year. This legal dispute actually began in 2007 before either of those games released and tracked until 2012. So that's actually pretty interesting. So they were in a legal dispute and still kept releasing games with the Unreal Engine, and then were ordered to recall them. It's kind of...
They must have been really confident that they were going to win that legal battle, that they still put a game out.
You know, I think there was like a back and forth, and I think like the developer tried suing Epic Games, you know, retaliated back and forth, you know what I mean? That's how these legal battles usually go, and the court actually ordered them to destroy all copies, not like just recall them. They had to destroy them. Like, I don't know what that meant. Did they have to like hammer them? Like the employees had to sit there and like smash the CDs or something? I don't know. But it's pretty...
They knock on your door to ask if you've purchased a copy of Two Human or X-Men Destiny. And if you said yes, they enter your house and destroy the game.
Yeah, with a flamethrower, just burn the Xbox or something that has it. I don't know. It's pretty crazy. And obviously they had to, you know, pay damages and, you know, the good stuff.
I feel good about this video overall. How do you feel about it? Do you think we covered the main ones?
Yeah, I think we covered almost everything we could find on recall games. What was your favorite one?
I think the early ones I talked about were just really unique situations, like the Fantasia and Sonic Blast Man. But I don't know. I mean, they're all pretty interesting to me. What about you?
You know, I think I like the funny one. I think the Wrestle Kingdom one is pretty funny, that they try to promote the Xbox in Japan and just failed so miserably that they had to recall the game. And here we are, the Xbox still irrelevant in Japan. I think it's a pretty funny story.
Also, huge thank you to our patrons and our YouTube members for making these types of format videos possible. If you guys have a couple of dollars burning a hole in your pocket, you could come over, pledge a couple dollars on either one of those, and it helps us make this type of content. We don't push it as hard as we probably should, but we are incredibly grateful for the people who do pledge money, because you know, it's nice to have some money to invest into things for videos and whatnot. So thank you guys. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you soon with a new video.